welcome to Turn the Page, the official podcast of the Syosset Public Library.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Turn the Page. I'm your host today, Jen, and I am joined by a writer who I've known for a very long time and who has experienced the book industry from every possible angle. She has a wealth of experience, but here today, she is here to talk about a sequel to a book that all of us loved very much, and we are so excited to talk about it. So welcome. Could I ask you to introduce yourself and your book?
Hi, Jen. I'm Hoenig, and I'm here to talk about Before She Was a Finley. And like you said, it's sort of a sequel and it's sort of a prequel because there's part of it, a young journalist comes onto the scene present time, but then we go back in time to learn about Grace Finley and why she walked out on her family.
It's so beautiful, and I really have known you for a very long time.
Yeah.
We worked together at Borders in the early aughts, and then we reunited many years later at a really lovely bookstore in Rockville Center called Turn of the Corkscrew. And we have spent many years talking about books and reading and writing. And so it's really nice to be doing this on the show here today.
Yes.
So I did talk a little bit about your career, but if you want to talk a little bit about your experiences and particularly how you think they shaped you as a writer, that would be really interesting.
Well, I've always loved writing, but I never dared believe to call myself a writer when I was younger, because writers were A.S. Byatt and Harper Lee and all these big names. And how could I even put myself into that type of, genre? And, so but I still wrote, but I didn't talk about it to anybody. And then I guess it was when I started my first novel that it just got a hold of me. And it took me about a month and a half to write the first draft. It took me almost 17 years later to get it to where I wanted it, because it's important to me that you make, you work on it. You don't, in today's self-publishing world, it makes me crazy that people think, oh, I can just write a book in, nano, like 6 months or 8 months. But so then when I started, like, okay, I had to justify it somehow. I'm like, if I'm going to be a writer, then I've got to really make a decision. So I took a lot of courses, took a lot of, writing classes, and I ended up getting a job at Borders Books, which you're familiar with. It was actually called Borders Books and Music. And I started at Westbury location. Then I went to Levittown, and then I went to Park Avenue in the city. And here I was, originally from upstate New York, with this little teeny tiny town, who went into Manhattan, which was so cool. And, I got to work, I was a national events coordinator, and I got to work with a lot of writers, and I got to meet a lot of agents, and I was very careful not to, cross that line with my position. But I ended up meeting somebody who found out that I was a writer, and he asked to see my novel. And of course I was beet red. And I was like, okay, I'll show it to him. And he loved it, but he said, and he's an editor, and he was like, we can't publish this because we're too small of a publisher for you. You need an agent. And it turned out that in the building, it was one of the highest profile agencies around, and an agent took me on, but kind of screwed me over. She wasn't hungry. She didn't need me, but she took me on anyway. And that's a long, tawdry story that I won't go into, but I hung in there. And I eventually got a book. It sounds silly, a book deal with iUniverse, which is a self-publisher. But my friend Peggy convinced me to go with them because the novel would have not found anything. It wouldn't have gone anywhere because this agent sabotaged me. And again, that's a long story why. And so I was like, all right, okay, I'll do it. And it went on to win awards. And I was like, okay, I can do this. And so then I worked on a second novel. And the first that one was published was Without Grace. And Grace in that one, as far as I was concerned, she did walk out on her family for a career in music. But it wasn't until one night, Jen, that I was driving home from the bookstore that we owned, and Grace said to me, people don't really know why I had to walk out. And I'm like, okay, what's this about? And so I had to write the book. I had to let her tell her story.
That is so fascinating. And it does begin to answer one of my questions, which was how much did you know about Grace's story while you were writing her absence in
Right.
Without Grace?
Well, yeah, just to tell you, in the beginning of Without Grace, the mother was there, Grace was there, and she served no purpose. I'm like, why is she even in this book? Which was very disconcerting to me. I said, but I didn't want her to die. It's like, I'm just going to have her leave. And it was, and all of a sudden she became such a big focal point of the novel after she left, which was very strange, but I loved it.
Yeah. Yeah, it's so interesting the way that it evolved out of Without Grace, because it is about her absence, but there are also other things going on that have to do with just families and small town life and secrets and betrayals. So I'm curious, with this one, when you returned to Without Grace, as you no doubt did too, remind yourself of what you had written and get a feel for that world again. Going back to read it again, did you look to sort of recapture what you were experiencing when you read it, or were you looking to experience it with new eyes and to see what maybe wasn't quite so clear to you at first, or were you looking for new things in it?
That's a good question. And I guess I was just really, it's funny you asked that, because there are certain scenes. There's one scene that's in Before She Was a Finley that is now Grace's point of view, that in Without Grace, it was her daughter's point of view. So I'm like, okay, why did she say this? Because now it was very important to me to keep the dialogue the same. But now we see why Grace said what she said. I'm like, and I love writing myself into a corner like that, because I'm like, okay, but it's got to make sense. I can't stand reading a book when all of a sudden the gods from heaven come down and, make something straighten out. So I guess Vicky was like history for me, and she's the daughter in Without Grace. She didn't really play a big part. She has a little part in Before She Was a Finley, but it was more Grace that I really was like trying to get to know. And I had to go back in time with history too. So I had to get the details with and there's a lot of things in the book from where I grew up that I knew from my father, like Grace went to the same school that my father had gone to and that kind of thing. So that was the important thing to me.
I was curious about what your research for sort of what you might call like historical world building, because people usually talk about world building in regards to fantasy or sci-fi, like building impossible worlds, but we also build the real worlds that our books are set in too. Did you do research beyond talking to family members to evoke the sort of, well, it covers a lot of decades, right? Starting in the sort
it
of
does.
late 30s, 40s, and into the 50s.
It does, yeah. And I did ask my younger brother, he's the one that's the real history buff in my family. So I would ask him, like, okay, because I had Grace living with her aunt up in the mountains, and I had a uncle, would be an uncle or a great uncle, and my grandfather, who was raised in the mountains with a large family, unlike Grace didn't have the large family. But I would say to my brother, how did they do this, or how did they survive? What did they just live off the land? And he goes, yeah, that's basically what they did. And so I was like, okay, that makes sense for Grace and her aunt to live off the land and survive in the winters up there. Oh, geez, the winters, right? Yeah, going through the snow, and and how you get from where do you get the things that you have to buy? Like, how would you get those? I have to find these things out. I can't just ignore these. I'm writing an historical fiction now, and it's going back like 1898, and I'm just like, oh gosh, I gotta figure this out. But that's okay. I don't, it makes it fun.
Yeah. I don't know. You find like new stories to tell, I think, while you are going to look at other sources and things like that.
Yep.
Research is really, really fun. I'd love to talk more about Grace, especially baby Grace.
Yeah.
She has a really tough childhood, and you feel immense empathy when I read for her. It's a very, very difficult way to grow up, not only because of the poverty and the sort of remoteness, but because of the particulars of her family
Right.
arrangement. Writing Grace, young Grace,
Mhm.
it's really tempting, I imagine, to write a write a character earlier through the lens of what you know is going to happen to them, if that makes sense.
Yeah,
Like, how do you capture like who Grace was before everything happened to her?
that's a good question. I don't know how I
Yeah.
did it.
Yeah.
I really, I just like, here's this young girl. Did I know that she was going to be attracted to Jack Finley? I had a feel she had to because she ended up marrying him and loving him. So I'm like, well, when did she meet him? When did she, and what brought them together? So I had to figure that all out.
Mm.
And I knew in Without Grace, I remembered, oh, he was into wrestling. All right, I guess that's going to play into into this too. And I had to go back and remember all that.
Mm.
But, as a child, like, I wanted her to have some resilience, but I also, having read the book, that she was suffering for things that her father had done, or maybe he didn't do, but something happened and it was such a big deal in her history that she couldn't shake it off. She couldn't get rid of it. And she didn't even know what it was until she started going to school.
Mm.
So that was I was like, oh, okay, let's roll with this.
Yeah. Yeah, it's very poignant, because she only has a sort of partial, very fragmentary idea of what may have happened.
Mhm.
Even after people start talking about it at school, it is largely unknown to her still because
Yeah.
at first people are very, very, hesitant to talk about it. How do you capture like a child's perspective? Because like as adults, we understand what is happening, but
Right,
like you need to sort of capture like a naivete
right.
when a child is watching grown-up hard things. How do you find like a childlike voice?
I don't know.
Yeah.
So I guess I go back in time and I think,
Mm.
how would I react to this? How
Mm.
would I, and I do remember certain, things that affected me as a child and how I viewed the world. And when she comes across that shack, there is a shack on that property that I'm familiar with. So in my mind's eye, I knew what it looked like and how she would want to get in there. And I would always be curious about that, like, what's in there? What, what's left behind? I love any old houses and that kind of thing. So that curiosity, even though she didn't find a whole lot there, except the Victrola, which played a major part into it, that more than I realized it would.
Mm. It's interesting because, in Without Grace, you're sort of experiencing the coming of age of Vicky,
Yeah.
And here we are experiencing that for Grace in a way that sort of like explains in some ways Vicky's coming of age. You can
Mhm.
see also like intergenerational trauma and
Yeah.
how like things that happen to a parent can vastly affect like their children.
Yeah.
Were there any ways in which like the story that emerged as you were filling out her past, did it surprise you in any
Oh,
real
yeah.
interesting ways?
Oh, yeah, definitely. And I had a different ending in mind, and I actually had some beta readers that read it, and they were like, "Oh, I don't know if we like this." And I'm like, "Well, that's just too bad." But then you let it gestate, and then I'm like, "All right, there's got to be somewhat of a rewarding end," I felt like. And I don't like that kind of book where like, oh, all the loose ends are tied up, but I felt like Grace has had it so hard. We need to give her something here. And so that surprised me. And I guess the uncle and the idiot that he was and how he behaved, it's like, ugh, some of the things that he did that surprised me when he showed up at the shack. I'm like, oh,
Yes.
oh, I didn't know that. Which you're a writer, so you know what that, it feels so exciting when your characters all of a sudden take over the story.
Yes, yeah. I feel like there's a point at which, you are telling the characters who they are,
Yes,
and then it switches and they start telling you who they are.
absolutely. I mean, when I was writing Without Grace, and I think this was my first experience as a writer to be so excited about that, when Vicky was going to be attacked by this guy, and her brother came and saved her from the guy. And, it would be so easier to her follow, oh, thank you, brother. But they were arguing at the time. They weren't getting along. And all of a sudden she said, no. And she wouldn't talk to him. And I'm like, oh, I really, and I go down to make supper for the kids, and I go, you're not gonna believe what Vicky just did. And they were like, Mom.
Yeah.
I go, but it just felt authentic to
Yeah.
me. And that's was so important for me.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's great. And you need characters who are rule breakers, because
Yeah.
like characters who follow the rules don't
Oh,
create
boring.
stories.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
So-
Yeah, they're boring, very boring.
Wow. What else are you working on right now? Are you writing anything else? You
I-
mentioned historical fiction.
Yeah, I am. Right now it's sort of dormant just because I've been doing so much promotion for this novel and that kind of thing. But I got back to it the other day a little bit. It's historical fiction. It takes place in upstate New York, and it's about this woman. Actually, I had a short story called Snow Angels and Somersaults and Snow Angels. I can't remember exactly the title, but it was this elderly woman, and she was in such a bad marriage, and she wanted freedom, and it was like the early 1900s. And that always stuck with me. I was like, I need to write this. And talk about surprising. I thought it was going to be her story, but it ends up being more a different character who started like, I'm like, who invited you? And they're taking over, and it's I'm still going through it. I haven't finished the first draft yet, but it's
Mm.
historical fiction. It takes place upstate and well near Lion Mountain. I don't know if you're familiar with that,
Mm.
with the iron ore and mining and all that kind of thing. So that requires some research, me contacting my brother. Do you know if they whatever, and I had a friend whose father died in the mining, when they had a collapse or whatever, and her mother's first husband died in the mining too. And I'm like, these are tragic stories. But so that plays into it along with the farmer and all this stuff. So yeah, that's what I'm working on.
In general, too, like throughout your work, you portray like a very different view of New York than a lot of literary fiction tends to
Mhm.
deal with. Like you get the city as an
Yeah.
environment, or like the suburbs, right? Like lots of suburban despair
Yes,
in
yes.
literature. But you don't really get like the rural North, especially rural New York. And I think that like you just capture a lot of really interesting perspectives
Thank
that get
you.
ignored in literature too.
Well, North Country Public Radio said to me when they reviewed Without Grace that we need more books that take place. And I feel like Before She Was a Finley answers that call. But it's just, and it's funny because when I first started writing, because I was not one who was loving where I grew up at all. I mean, when I was 8 years old, for my birthday, my mom wouldn't know what I wanted. I said a sidewalk. And I was serious. So I really didn't love living in the country. And I just thought, oh, I love Manhattan. And I just love the whole city, but you can't shake those roots and what you know. And it's something I enjoy writing about.
Nice. I had no idea how much of my adult life would be, like you love things when you're a kid, maybe a little bit, then you hate them when you're like a teen and an early adult, and then
Yeah.
like the rest of your life you just sort of like start loving them.
It's
Yeah.
It's very true. Yeah, no, absolutely. I have more of a respect for it and for my, siblings that stayed up there. And not that they have a respect for the city, but because they don't, it seems like the boogeyman lives here. But no, I love that, I can be in Manhattan and be very happy. And I can only take so much of upstate New York though. I'll admit it, but it's still nice to write about
Yeah,
my
absolutely.
suburban home.
Yeah. You get to experience many worlds
Exactly.
through your pen. Yeah.
Exactly.
And so I know that you're also podcasting. I've listened to your podcast, and your
Oh.
podcast co-host, or one of them, has been sort of lurking here in the back
Yes,
very
yes.
pleasantly.
I'm listening to every word.
What's your name, little
My
podcast
name
host?
is Peggy Zieran, also a bookseller, not a writer, a
No.
reader.
Although, Jen, I have to tell you, I can't tell you how many times Peggy will say, there's this great idea for a book, Carol, and she'll tell me the idea. I go, write it, because
Yes.
I'm not a writer. Could you please tell her that we're not born
Yeah,
writers?
yeah.
And that's what I tell her. It's not like, all of a sudden, like, oh, I can write a novel and I don't have to.
It would be a couple of paragraphs long if I wrote it. It would say, okay, this is what happened. Dum, dum, dum.
And that would be your outline. Yeah, but she's also the type like, no, they can't do that. That's stupid. She was.
That's
So-
great. I've also known Peggy for a super long time. We were talking about Borders before, and even before Syosset, I used to, when I was like 16, 17 years old, come up to you at Levittown and be like, can I have a job? Like, you have to turn 18. Like,
Oh, that's so.
That's right, and she did.
yeah, I waited.
But did we say the name of our podcast?
No.
It's Wildflowers Podcast, Books, Booze, and Banter.
Yes.
And naturally, we talk about books. And
But what do we start with?
we go ahead, Peggy. What do
Well,
we
we
start?
start with a little banter. There are three of us. Our friend Judy,
Mhm.
who was also a former Borders employee.
Yeah.
She's now a lawyer.
Yeah.
We see each other maybe once or twice a month. And then so we do a little banter, what's going on, or maybe we get a little political.
A little.
Yeah.
And then we have to crack open a bottle of wine and we do a wine tasting.
And it's usually wine, but we've had other beverages too.
Yes, yes. And then we go into a book review.
Mm-hmm.
One of us, it'll be our turn, it's Carol's turn to do a review. She talks about the book that she read and either recommends it or doesn't.
No, I always,
We try not to
Yeah.
ever review a book
No.
that we didn't like.
no, I'll never
Yeah.
do that.
Yeah.
Yeah. Because if I'm not going to recommend it, I'm not going to talk
Yeah.
about it.
Yes. Good vibes only.
Yeah,
And then we
exactly.
rotate through different subjects.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
it could be anything, like she could pick a subject.
Mhm.
The last
Yeah.
subject I did was about drag queens.
Yeah.
Nice.
Yeah.
Yes.
I heard something on the radio about RuPaul and I said, oh, drag queens.
Yes.
And it's funny because when we first started, we all said, well, how many topics can we pick? Like, what can we talk about? And we made questions in this little a basket, like, okay, we'll pick these out. So we haven't even really needed them. We just
Yeah.
always have, like Judy did one about Mother Jones. I don't know if you're familiar who she was,
interesting.
but
Yeah.
Judy picks these interesting historical figures. And Peggy, if you listen to our podcast, you find out that she has a crush on Benjamin Franklin.
Oh,
I always have.
yes.
Whole life. I love him.
He's very charming.
He's very charming, yes. He was a big flirt too.
And America's first bookseller.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right.
Now it all comes together.
That's right.
Yeah.
Well, this has been really lovely talking to all of you. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank
It's
you
been
for
so
having
nice
us.
to see you again.
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
We should do this more. We're just talking about, I have to, stop by Wildflowers. So I'll come.
Yes, we
And
want
drink
you to come.
wine.
Yeah, and you
That's
got actually to
right.
see the video,
That's
our eye rolls at each other and laughing. And there was something Peggy did the other day. I couldn't stop laughing. I just couldn't stop
Oh,
laughing.
because when people are speaking, they say, well, I do that.
Oh,
So I
yeah.
whispered, I said, you said do.
Oh my God, like there's that childlike attitude that
Yes,
comes
see?
into play.
And but I love that you can segue from a cultural critique of the current political thing and then do jokes.
Yeah,
together.
that's right.
Exactly.
You
Exactly.
need both in your
Mhm.
life. So
Yes,
This
indeed.
was so nice, Jen. I really
Okay.
thank you for having
Mm.
me. And the book comes out September 10th.
Mhm.
But I guess that will already have aired.
yeah, by the time it's out, it will the book will be out in the world. So go to your favorite. Well, where should they go? Where would you like them
Well,
to go
they
to
could
get
go
it?
to their favorite bookstore. Please support your
Mm-hmm.
bookstore. It turns out that Books A Million placed a nice big order for me, which I'll tell you the story afterward. But yeah,
Mhm.
Nice.
but yeah.
Yeah, so go get it. Or the library too. We might have a
Yes,
copy. We're gonna
yeah,
get
I hope you
one,
do.
So yeah.
That would be great.
Yay. All right, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. It is now time to close this chapter.
It's time to close this chapter of Turn the Page. Join us for the next episode.